Name the greatest military commander of the 15th century. You probably said someone else. The correct answer is a man who fought the Ottoman Empire for 25 consecutive years and never lost a single major battle. Not most of them, every single one. Against armies that outnumbered him as much as 8-1. The Pope personally called him the savior of Christendom. The Sultan, the most powerful ruler on earth at the time, reportedly kept a portrait of him and called him the Dragon. His name was Skanderbeg. And the fact that you don't know that name, that it didn't come to mind when I asked, is not an accident. It's the story. Because Skanderbeg didn't just win battles. He held a door closed. The door between the Ottoman Empire and an undefended Western Europe, at the exact moment when Constantinople had just fallen and there was nothing else standing in the way. He held it for 25 years. With an Albanian mountain army that had no business surviving a single campaign, let alone a generation of them. And when he died, of fever, in his bed, the one enemy he couldn't outmaneuver, Western Europe mourned him, sent tributes, called him irreplaceable, then forgot him almost completely. That is what this video is actually about. Not just who he was, but why you don't know, and what that silence says about the history you've been given. Before we begin this journey through one of the most forgotten and brutal stories of the Balkans, I need to ask you something. Where are you watching from? Write your location in the comments. And if this is your first time on the channel, subscribe. Because what follows is a story the chronicles barely recorded, but memory never let go. Let's establish one thing before we go further. Skanderbeg's record is not disputed. It is documented by Ottoman chroniclers, by Venetian diplomatic dispatches, by papal correspondence, by the accounts of men who fought alongside him and against him. The victories are real. The numbers are real. The silence that followed is real. His full name was Gjergj Kastrioti. He was born around 1405 in the Albanian highlands, the son of a regional lord named Gjon Kastrioti, in a world that was already fracturing under the pressure of Ottoman expansion. He died in 1468 in the coastal town of Lejë, having spent the last quarter century of his life doing something that contemporary military historians still struggle to fully explain: defeating a superpower repeatedly with what amounted to a medieval mountain militia. The Ottoman Empire at the height of its power was not merely a large army, it was a system. A machine built over generations for the singular purpose of conquest. It had absorbed Anatolia, Bulgaria, Serbia, Macedonia, and Greece. It had taken Constantinople, the new Rome, the city that had stood for 1100 years, in 1453. It had resources, logistics, professional soldiers, siege engineers, artillery, and the deepest military tradition in the known world. It had swallowed everything in its path. And then it met a man in the Albanian mountains who had spent his entire childhood inside that machine. That detail is the key to everything. Because Skanderbeg did not fight the Ottomans as an outsider. He fought them as someone they had trained, someone who had learned their doctrine, studied their tactics, commanded their armies, and eventually decided, for reasons that are complicated and contested, to turn everything he had learned against them. He was the Ottoman military's most dangerous creation, a student who had fully absorbed the lesson and then walked out the door. This is his story, and it is long overdue. To understand what Skanderbeg meant, you first have to understand the world he was born into. The 15th century Balkans were not a stable region going through temporary disruption. They were a civilization in the process of being dismantled, piece by piece, with methodical efficiency. The Ottoman Empire was not a distant threat on the horizon. It was already there, already inside the room. By the time Gjergj Kastrioti was born, the Ottomans had already beaten the Serbs at Kosovo in 1389, the battle that shattered the medieval Serbian state and echoes in the region's identity to this day. They had absorbed Bulgaria. They had defeated the Crusade of Nicopolis in 1396, where a coalition of European knights, thought to be unstoppable, had been broken in an afternoon. By the early 1400s, the Ottoman Sultan controlled more of the Balkan peninsula than any Christian power did. The only thing that had temporarily slowed the advance was a catastrophe from the east. Timur, Tamerlane, who swept out of Central Asia and defeated Sultan Bayezid the Far at the Battle of Ankara in 1402, capturing the Sultan himself and fracturing the Ottoman state into a brief civil war. That pause bought the Christian kingdoms of the Balkans perhaps 2 decades of breathing room. But the Ottoman Civil War ended. The state reconsolidated. And by the reign of Murad II, who took the throne in 1421, the machine was running again. Faster, if anything. More disciplined, more hungry. Albania in this period was not a unified nation. It was a patchwork of highland clans and regional lords, known as Lords of the Mountains, each controlling their own territory, frequently feuding with each other and possessing no centralized military or political structure capable of resisting an imperial advance. The Albanian lords were occasionally vassals of Venice, occasionally allies of Serbia, occasionally independent, always fragmented. Their geography, steep mountains, narrow valleys, poor roads, had protected them somewhat. But geography only holds for so long. Gjon Kastrioti, Skanderbeg's father, was one of these lords. He controlled a stretch of territory in central Albania centered on the fortress town of Kruje. He was not a minor figure. He commanded loyalty, had alliances, and maintained a regional presence. But he was also operating inside the gravitational pull of Ottoman expansion, which meant his independence was conditional. It was granted, not guaranteed, and the Ottomans made certain he understood the difference. The method the Ottomans used to manage vassal lords throughout the Balkans was elegant and brutal. They required hostages, sons specifically. A lord who sent his son to the Ottoman court as a hostage was a lord who could be trusted to remain loyal, because the alternative was to endanger his own child. This was not a threat delivered in anger. It was simply the standard diplomatic arrangement. Everyone understood the logic. Gjon Kastrioti sent 4 of his sons to the Ottoman court. Gjergj was one of them. He was likely between 9 and 14 years old when he left the Albanian mountains and entered the world of the enemy. He would spend the next 20 years there, and he would not return as a hostage. He would return as something far more dangerous. Picture what it meant to be taken into the Ottoman court as a child hostage in the early 15th century. It was not imprisonment. That is the detail that matters. The Ottoman system for integrating the sons of subject peoples was sophisticated, far more sophisticated than a dungeon. The boys were educated, trained, converted, absorbed into the Ottoman identity until they either ceased to be what they had been or learned to wear 2 faces simultaneously. The institution behind this process was called the Devshirme, the collection, and it produced some of the most capable administrators and military commanders in Ottoman history. Boys were taken, raised in the imperial system, trained in warfare, law, diplomacy, and governance, and deployed back into the world as instruments of Ottoman power. Many of them rose to extraordinary positions: grand viziers, generals, provincial governors. The empire was not shy about using talent regardless of its origin. Gjergj Kastrioti entered this world and excelled inside it. He converted to Islam, whether by genuine belief, pragmatic calculation, or simple pressure, we cannot say with certainty. He learned Turkish, Persian, Arabic. He studied military strategy. He trained in horsemanship, archery, swordsmanship. By the accounts of Ottoman contemporaries, he was exceptional, physically imposing, intellectually sharp, and possessing an instinct for command that distinguished him early. Sultan Murad II noticed. He gave the young Albanian a name that carried weight: Skanderbeg, Alexander the Lord. It was a name invoking Alexander the Great, a deliberate signal about expectations, and Skanderbeg, as the name was rendered in the Latin and Albanian sources, did not disappoint. He was given command of Ottoman cavalry units. He was sent on campaigns. He performed. For roughly 2 decades, Gjergj Kastrioti served the empire that had taken him as a child. He commanded Ottoman forces in Anatolia. He administered territories. He was, by any external measure, a successful and loyal officer of the Sultan's military system. His brothers, taken hostage alongside him, died. Some sources suggest poisoning, though this cannot be confirmed with certainty. His father's lands in Albania continued to be absorbed into Ottoman administrative control. The question historians have debated for centuries is what was happening inside Gjergj during those 20 years. Was he calculating from the beginning? Did he experience a gradual reawakening of Albanian and Christian identity? Or did the defection, when it came, emerge from something more immediate, a specific grievance, a political calculation, a moment of recognition that the opportunity had arrived? We don't know. He left no memoirs, no letters that survive from this period. What we have are the chronicler's accounts, written after the fact, many of them shaped by the legend that had already begun to form around his name. What we know is this. By 1443, Gjergj Kastrioti had spent roughly 20 years inside the most powerful military system in the world. He had learned how it worked, not theoretically, but practically. He had commanded its forces. He understood its strengths, and more critically, its limitations. He knew how Ottoman armies moved, how they communicated, where they were vulnerable, what they expected from opponents, and what they had no answer for. He was, in a sense, the Ottoman Empire's most detailed tactical manual, and in the autumn of 1443, he decided to use it against them. November 1443. The Ottoman army was moving through the Balkans on campaign, and Skanderbeg was serving within it, commanding a force of Albanian cavalry under Ottoman command. It was a routine deployment by Ottoman standards, another chapter in the long grinding consolidation of Balkan territory. Then, near the town of Niš, in what is now Serbia, something happened that the chroniclers describe but cannot fully explain. A Hungarian and Crusader army under János Hunyadi, one of the few Christian military commanders actively fighting Ottoman expansion, had recently won a significant engagement and was pushing into Ottoman territory. The Ottoman campaign was in disruption. The political situation was unstable. In the chaos, Skanderbeg made his move. He took approximately 300 Albanian cavalrymen, deserted the Ottoman column, and rode hard for Albania. By some accounts, he first obtained, through means that were either deceptive or coerced, a forged document in the name of the Sultan ordering the Ottoman commander at Kruje to hand over the fortress to him. Whether this story is precise or embellished, the outcome is documented. On November 28, 1443, Gjergj Kastrioti arrived at the gates of Kruje, his family's ancestral fortress that had been under Ottoman control for years, and took it back. He replaced the Ottoman crescent with a flag bearing a double-headed eagle on a red field. He publicly renounced Islam and returned to Christianity. He declared himself Lord of Albania. That flag is now the national flag of Albania. That date, November 28th, is celebrated as Albanian Flag Day. What he had just done, objectively evaluated, was catastrophic by any standard of rational survival calculation. He had deserted the Ottoman army. He had used deception against the Sultan's forces. He had reclaimed a territory the empire considered its own. He had publicly apostatized from Islam, which under Ottoman law carried its own severe implications. He had announced himself, in every possible way, as an enemy. The Ottoman Empire's response to such declarations was not gentle, and he knew that better than almost anyone alive, because he had spent 20 years watching how the empire dealt with rebellion. He had perhaps 3 months before the response would come. He used them. He moved through the Albanian highlands with extraordinary speed, reclaiming several other fortresses and establishing a territorial base. He reached out to neighboring Albanian lords, some of whom were his rivals, some of whom were actively hostile to him, and made an argument that was simultaneously simple and radical, that the only way any of them survived what was coming was together. Most of them listened. In March 1444, at the town of Lezhë, the Albanian lords met in council. Skanderbeg presided. What emerged from that meeting was the League of Leisure, a coalition of Albanian clans and lords who agreed, for the first time in living memory, to subordinate their individual rivalries to collective defense. Skanderbeg was named commander-in-chief of the combined Albanian forces. The League was fragile, contested, and would fracture and reform several times over the following decades. Albanian politics was not made simpler by existential threat, but it existed, and it placed a unified military command in the hands of the one man in Albania who had the training, the intelligence, and the tactical knowledge to give an Ottoman army something it had not encountered in years: a serious fight. Before the first major Ottoman force arrived to destroy him, Skanderbeg did something that would define every engagement that followed. He studied his terrain the way he had been taught to study an enemy. The Albanian highlands were not the open Anatolian plains where Ottoman cavalry could deploy at scale and sweep through opposition. They were not the broad Danubian plains where large armies could maneuver freely. They were narrow valleys, steep ridges, dense forests, rocky passes where a large force became slow, supply lines became nightmares, and the advantages of numerical superiority collapsed against geography. Skanderbeg had grown up in these mountains as a child. He had spent 20 years studying how the Ottoman military moved and where it was vulnerable. Now, he assembled those two bodies of knowledge into something that no conventional military doctrine of the period had a prepared answer for. His strategy was not to meet Ottoman armies in open battle where numbers would decide. It was to deny them the battle they wanted and force them into the one he had chosen. He used mobility. His cavalry forces could move through mountain terrain at speeds that surprised larger forces. He used intelligence, a network of scouts and local informants that meant he almost always knew where the enemy was before the enemy knew where he was. He used deception, feinting retreats, setting ambushes in passes, appearing where he was not expected, and disappearing before a response could be organized. And when he did commit to a direct engagement, he chose the ground with surgical precision. He never fought where the terrain favored his opponent. He always fought where the terrain was a weapon he controlled. The first major test came in June 1444, at a place called Torviol. An Ottoman force of approximately 25,000 men under the command of Ali Pasha entered Albanian territory with the explicit mission of eliminating Skanderbeg and re-establishing Ottoman control. It was not a punitive raid. It was a campaign. Skanderbeg's forces numbered somewhere between 7,000 and 15,000, depending on the source. The figures vary, but every source agrees he was substantially outnumbered. He positioned his forces in a valley flanked by forested hillsides. He allowed the Ottoman advance column to enter the kill zone. Then he struck simultaneously from multiple directions. Ali Pasha's army broke. Several thousand Ottoman soldiers were killed. The Pasha himself barely escaped. The Albanian forces suffered casualties, but they held the field. The Ottoman Empire had lost a major engagement to an opponent they expected to destroy in a single campaign. It was not a skirmish. It was not a lucky ambush. It was a deliberate, tactically sophisticated military defeat of a professional imperial army. It would not be the last. Over the following 3 years, Skanderbeg fought and won engagements at Otonete, at Mokra, at Oranik, at Polog. Each victory followed a variation of the same principle. Choose the terrain, control the intelligence, strike before the enemy stabilizes, never let a larger force dictate the nature of the fight. Ottoman commanders adapted. He adapted faster. Western Europe was watching, and what it saw was something it had not seen in a generation: someone pushing back. By 1450, Murad II had seen enough reports. Multiple Ottoman commanders had failed to eliminate Skanderbeg. Multiple campaigns had been mounted and broken against Albanian mountain defenses. The League of Leisure, fragile as it was, had held. The fortress of Kruje had not fallen. Murad II decided he would handle this personally. This was a statement of severity. Ottoman sultans did not typically lead campaigns against regional lords in small mountain territories. That was work for governors and generals. The fact that Murad II personally assembled an army, estimates range between 100,000 and 160,000 men, though Ottoman army sizes are frequently inflated in contemporary sources, and the real figure may have been closer to 60,000 to 80,000, and marched it into Albania signals how seriously the court had come to regard Skanderbeg's resistance. This was not containment. This was termination. Skanderbeg knew he could not stop this force in open battle. The numerical disparity was too severe. His strategy shifted. He would not try to defeat the army. He would make it fail on its own. He stripped the countryside ahead of the Ottoman advance. Food, livestock, anything useful was moved or destroyed. He harassed supply lines with fast-moving cavalry raids. He withdrew his population and forces into the mountains and into fortified positions, with Kruje as the central anchor. He made the Albanian territory a landscape that could not sustain a large army for long, while simultaneously ensuring that the large army could not go home without having achieved its objective, without catastrophic loss of prestige. The siege of Kruje began in May 1450. Murad Tet arrayed his forces around the fortress. He brought siege artillery. He had engineers. He had numbers that should have reduced any medieval fortification to rubble in weeks. By every conventional military calculation, Kruje should have fallen within a month. It did not fall in a month. Skanderbeg was not inside the fortress. He was in the mountains with his mobile force, conducting a campaign of continuous harassment against Ottoman supply lines, reinforcements, and foraging parties. The garrison inside Kruje, commanded by a capable lieutenant named Vrana Conti, held the walls. The population endured. Month after month, the siege ground on. The Ottoman army, far from its supply bases, fighting an enemy that never presented itself for the decisive engagement that Ottoman doctrine required, began to feel the weight of the campaign. Disease moved through the siege lines. Supplies became irregular. Morale degraded. After 4 months, Murad II withdrew. He had brought the largest army seen in Albania in a generation. He had personally commanded it. He had failed to take a single Albanian fortress. And Skanderbeg was still alive, still mobile, still undefeated. The Sultan died the following year, in 1451, without having resolved the Albanian problem. His son, who took the throne as Mehmed II, would go on to take Constantinople in 1453, the most significant military achievement of the century. He would be called Mehmed the Conqueror. He would go on to systematically absorb Greece, Serbia, and most of the remaining Christian territories in the Balkans. He would try, multiple times, to finish what his father had started in Albania. He would fail every time Skanderbeg was alive to stop him. May 29, 1453. The walls of Constantinople, which had stood for over 1,000 years, gave way before Ottoman siege artillery and the weight of an army that Mehmed II had assembled with the specific purpose of ending the Eastern Roman Empire. The last Byzantine emperor, Constantine X Palaiologos, reportedly removed his imperial regalia and died fighting in the breach. The city that had been the center of Christian civilization, the keeper of Roman law, the anchor of Orthodox faith, fell in a single day of assault after weeks of siege. The shock that moved through European courts was total. Constantinople was not just a city, it was a symbol. It was Rome's continuation. It was the idea that there was a Christian civilization that could not be broken. And now, that idea was gone. What replaced it was fear. Real, documented, political fear. Pope Nicholas V called for a new crusade. He got rhetorical support and almost no armies. The Italian city-states were too busy fighting each other. The French crown was still recovering from the 100 Years' War. The Holy Roman Emperor had internal rebellions to manage. Hungary under Hunyadi was fighting its own border wars. England was about to slide into the Wars of the Roses. Western Europe, in 1453, had no coherent military response to the Ottoman Empire. It had good intentions, papal bulls, and the memory of failed crusades. Against a sultan who had just taken Constantinople with siege artillery and professional infantry, none of that mattered. Except in Albania. Skanderbeg had heard what happened to Constantinople. He had almost certainly understood its implications faster than most European rulers, because he had spent 20 years inside the Ottoman military system and knew precisely what Mehmed II was capable of. He also knew that with Constantinople gone, the next logical line of Ottoman expansion into Western Europe ran directly through the Adriatic coast, through Albania, through Epirus, toward Italy. He was not guarding a regional territory anymore. He was guarding a corridor. This is the strategic reality that the Pope's correspondence began to reflect. Letters from Rome addressed to Skanderbeg in the 1450s are not the letters of a distant patron writing to an obscure lord. They are the letters of a frightened institution to the man it had identified as its most important military asset. Pope Calixtus III called him Athleta Christi, the champion of Christ. He sent money occasionally. More importantly, he sent recognition. He told Skanderbeg, in writing, in official correspondence, that what he was doing mattered to the survival of Christendom. Skanderbeg continued fighting. In 1455, an Ottoman force under Isak Beg Evrenosolu invaded Albania. Skanderbeg met them at the Otonete Valley and defeated them. In 1456, another force, another defeat. In 1457, Mehmed II sent one of his best commanders, Isa Beg Ishakovic, with a force that some sources estimate at 70,000 to 80,000 men, though again, these figures should be treated with appropriate skepticism, toward Albania with orders to end the resistance permanently. Skanderbeg had fewer than 15,000. He chose a place called Albulena, September 2nd, 1457, the Shkumbin River Valley in central Albania. Terrain that Skanderbeg knew intimately, a plain flanked by rising ground with wooded hillsides that could conceal cavalry. Not ideal for a large army that needed room to deploy. Ideal for a commander who intended to fight on his own terms. The Ottoman force under Isabeg had moved through Albanian territory expecting either flight or a defensive siege. What they found instead was Skanderbeg's army, deployed and waiting, in a position that had been chosen with the specific geometry of the coming fight already calculated. Skanderbeg divided his force. His main body held the center. His cavalry, the element he had always used as his decisive instrument, was positioned on the flanks, concealed in the wooded terrain. The plan was not subtle in concept, but it required precision in execution. Hold the Ottoman center, prevent them from deploying their full numerical advantage, and then strike both flanks simultaneously with cavalry in a double envelopment. It required his soldiers to hold under severe pressure before the flanking force could do its work. It required timing in terrain that made communication difficult. It required that the Ottoman commanders not identify the flanking positions before the moment of commitment. Every component worked. The Ottoman center advanced and made contact with Skanderbeg's main line. The fighting was severe. His men absorbed a frontal assault from a force dramatically larger than their own. But they held. And when the moment arrived, when the Ottoman formation had committed fully and lost the ability to quickly reorient, Skanderbeg's cavalry swept from both flanks. The result was catastrophic for the Ottoman force. Isabeg's army did not withdraw in order. It broke. Thousands of Ottoman soldiers were killed. The commander escaped. The Albanian force held the field. Albulena was not a skirmish. It was not a defensive action. It was an offensive engagement against a substantially larger force, won by superior tactical planning and disciplined execution, in which the smaller army inflicted decisive casualties and routed an imperial military column. When the news reached Rome, Pope Calixtus III ordered prayers of thanksgiving across the Latin Church. He wrote to Skanderbeg directly, calling the victory evidence of divine favor and urging continued resistance. Venice, which had complicated and shifting interests in the region, dispatched congratulations. The Hungarian court took notice. Throughout Catholic Europe, the name Skanderbeg was spoken with something approaching awe. Among the Ottomans, the reaction was different. Mehmed II, who was in the middle of consolidating his conquests and planning new campaigns elsewhere, reportedly received the news of Albulena with controlled fury. He had sent capable commanders. He had sent large forces. The Albanian lord with his mountain army had destroyed them. By several accounts, Mehmed kept a portrait of Skanderbeg. Whether he called him a dragon, as some sources suggest, or used some other term of grudging recognition, the pattern is clear. The Sultan had developed a specific and serious fixation on his enemy in the Albanian mountains. Not because Albania was strategically critical in isolation, but because Skanderbeg had become something more than a territorial problem. He had become a symbol of the one thing the Ottoman system was supposed to make impossible: sustained, successful resistance. That symbol could not be allowed to stand. The years after Albulena did not bring peace. They brought continuation. One of the aspects of Skanderbeg's story that gets compressed in the popular telling is the sheer duration of the struggle. 25 years is a long time to fight a war. It is long enough for young soldiers to become veterans, long enough for veterans to become old men, long enough for the psychological texture of constant conflict to settle into something that isn't heroism anymore, something grayer, more exhausted, more costly in ways that don't show up in battle reports. Albania was not a rich territory. It was not a territory with deep reserves of manpower or economic surplus. Every campaign that Skanderbeg won left a landscape that needed to be rebuilt. Every garrison held cost men who couldn't be replaced easily. The population of the Albanian highlands was bearing a weight that was not sustainable indefinitely. Taxes were levied to fund defense. Men were away from their families and fields. Harvest cycles were disrupted by campaigns. Villages near contested areas were evacuated, attacked, or simply abandoned. The League of Leisure was also never the coherent military alliance it appears to be in retrospect. Albanian lords were independent, prideful, and frequently resistant to Skanderbeg's authority over their forces. There were defections, lords who made separate accommodations with the Ottomans, who decided that surrender offered better terms than continued resistance. Skanderbeg spent considerable energy on internal Albanian politics that never appears in the military record: negotiations, threats, reconciliations, punishments. The coalition that allowed him to fight was not a given. It was something he rebuilt, repeatedly, through force of personality and political calculation. There were also the periods of truce. In 1461, Skanderbeg negotiated a temporary peace with the Ottomans that gave Albania several years of relative stability. He used that time to seek stronger alliances with Western powers: Venice, the Kingdom of Naples under Alfonso V, the papacy. He traveled to Italy in 1461, where he was received with extraordinary honor. He met with Alfonso of Naples, who had already been funding Albanian resistance. The encounter produced alliance, additional resources, and the image, durable, repeated in contemporary artwork, of Skanderbeg as the physical embodiment of Christian military virtue: tall, armored, bearing the double-headed eagle. He returned to find the truce ending and the Ottoman pressure resuming. In 1466, Mehmed II himself led another major campaign into Albania. This was the Sultan who had taken Constantinople. He had subsequently conquered most of Greece, pushed into Serbia, was in the process of absorbing the remaining Christian territories of the Balkans. He was, by 1466, arguably the most militarily successful ruler in the world. And he came to Albania himself, as his father had, with an army that dwarfed anything the region could field against it. He besieged Kruje. Kruje held. Mehmed withdrew, unable to reduce the fortress, and left a blocking force. Skanderbeg broke through it. A third Ottoman attempt the following year, in 1467, also failed to take Kruje, while Skanderbeg remained active in the field. The Sultan who had ended the Eastern Roman Empire had tried 3 times to end the Albanian resistance. He had failed all 3 times. And then the thing happened that no army and no stratagem could prevent. January 1468. Skanderbeg was in the coastal town of Leisure when the illness took hold. Not a wound, not a battle. Malaria, or some fever of similar type, the sources are not precise. A disease that moved through the Balkans without regard for military genius or strategic importance. He had survived ambushes, sieges, direct confrontations with Ottoman armies numbering in the tens of thousands. He could not survive a parasite. He was somewhere between 60 and 65 years old. He had spent roughly 20 years inside the Ottoman military system and 25 years fighting it. He had spent the better part of a decade rarely sleeping in the same place twice. He had managed a political coalition of stubborn, rival mountain lords while simultaneously conducting a military campaign against the most powerful empire in the known world. He was, by any reasonable assessment, exhausted in ways that went beyond the physical. He died on January 17, 1468. The reaction in Western Europe was genuine mourning. Pope Paul II, the same institution that had been calling him the champion of Christendom for years, openly lamented that Christendom had lost its shield. Venice sent dispatches expressing alarm, not just sympathy. The King of Naples mourned publicly. These were not diplomatic formalities. They were responses to the recognition that something irreplaceable had just ended. Because in practical terms, what died with Skanderbeg was not simply a man. It was a system. His network of intelligence, his relationships with Albanian lords, his ability to hold the coalition together, his tactical knowledge, all of that was personal to him. It did not transfer cleanly to a successor. His son, Gjon Castrioti II, was young and lacked the authority and experience his father had built over decades. The League of Leisure began to fragment almost immediately. The Ottomans knew what had happened. The Albanian resistance, which had seemed permanent under Skanderbeg's leadership, suddenly looked different. The fortress of Kruje, which had held against 3 Ottoman campaigns, was now a defensive position without its architect. Mehmed II sent forces within months. In 1478, 10 years after Skanderbeg's death, Kruje finally fell. The fortress that had defied the full might of the Ottoman Empire for a generation surrendered to a siege that Skanderbeg was no longer alive to break. Albanian resistance continued in scattered form for a few more years, but the organized, unified defense that had defined the previous quarter century was over. Hundreds of thousands of Albanians fled during the Ottoman consolidation that followed, to Italy, to Greece, to the Adriatic Islands. Communities descended from those refugees still exist today, particularly in southern Italy, where they are known as the Arbereshe. They brought with them the Albanian language, the Christian faith, and the memory of Skanderbeg. The door that he had held closed for 25 years was now open. The Ottomans moved through, but they moved through later than they would have. Much later, with a delay that had consequences no one can fully calculate. Decades during which Western Europe recovered from the shock of Constantinople's fall, during which Italian city-states rebuilt their walls and their fleets, during which the geopolitical map of the Mediterranean rearranged itself in ways that would eventually contain Ottoman expansion through means other than individual military genius. Did Skanderbeg save Western Europe? The question is impossible to answer definitively. History does not run controlled experiments. We do not have the version of events where he never defected, never held Kruje, never won at Torviol and Albulena. We cannot measure what would have happened in the 1450s and 1460s if the Albanian corridor had been open to Ottoman expansion 25 years earlier, at the exact moment when no other military power in Europe had a coherent response to Mehmed II. But we know what he did. We know he held. We know it was real. And that should be enough to warrant remembering. Here is where the story becomes a different kind of story. Because Skanderbeg was not forgotten immediately. In fact, for the century following his death, he was one of the most celebrated military figures in Europe. His biography was written by Marin Barleti, published in 1508, one of the most widely read historical works of the Renaissance. It was translated into multiple languages and circulated across the continent. Machiavelli referenced him. Cervantes mentioned him. Voltaire wrote about him. Pope Pius II placed him in the same sentence as Achilles and Alexander. His name appeared in literature, in sermons, in political arguments about European unity for more than 100 years after his death. And then, gradually, it faded. By the 19th century, the name that had been cited by Machiavelli and commemorated by popes was largely absent from the Western European historical canon. By the 20th century, it was essentially invisible in the mainstream educational curriculum across Western Europe and North America. Today, ask the average educated person in Britain, France, Germany, or the United States about the greatest military commanders of the 15th century, and the name Skanderbeg will almost never appear. Why? There are several answers, and they are not mutually exclusive. The first is geographic and national. Skanderbeg belongs to Albanian history, and Albania is a small country with limited geopolitical influence in the modern world. The historiography of Western Europe has been shaped largely by the major powers: France, England, the Holy Roman Empire's successors, Italy, and their own national narratives. A figure who belongs to none of those narratives, who fought in a territory that later fell entirely outside Western European political interest, simply had no institutional home in the histories those powers wrote and taught. The second is religious and denominational. The Catholic Church's relationship with Albanian history became complicated as Albania was absorbed into the Ottoman system and as Protestantism changed the internal dynamics of European Christianity. The papal letters calling Skanderbeg the champion of Christendom were products of a specific moment in Catholic self-definition that the subsequent centuries de-emphasized. His story was deeply Catholic in its framing, and as Catholic historical advocacy declined in Protestant-influenced historiography, so did his prominence. The third is the Ottoman erasure. Ottoman historical tradition did not celebrate Skanderbeg. This is unsurprising. He was their enemy. But the Ottomans controlled Albanian archives and historical institutions after 1478, and Ottoman administrative culture had little incentive to preserve detailed records of the one man who had consistently defeated them. The chronicles that survive are fragmentary on the Albanian side, and what survives from the Ottoman side is filtered through the perspective of an institution that lost to him repeatedly. The fourth is structural. Skanderbeg's story does not fit neatly into the grand narratives that Western historical writing preferred. The Crusades, despite their failures, fit a narrative about Western expansionism and religious conflict. The fall of Constantinople fits a narrative about civilizational clash and the end of an era. Skanderbeg's story is harder to package. It is the story of a man who was raised by the enemy and turned against it, fighting in a territory that Western Europe then failed to support and ultimately abandoned, on behalf of a people who were subsequently absorbed into the empire he fought against for a generation. It is not a triumph narrative. It is not a clean loss. It is a complicated, ambivalent, morally thorny story that resists the simplifications that historical education tends to prefer. That complexity, in the end, may be why it was easier to forget than to teach. But there is something else worth naming directly. The history of the Balkans has been, for several centuries, history that Western Europe preferred not to look at too closely. The region was poor, contested, ethnically complex, religiously layered, and politically inconvenient. It did not fit the categories that made history legible to Western audiences. Its heroes did not look like the heroes in the canonical stories. Its conflicts did not resolve into satisfying outcomes. So it was simplified, minimized, or omitted. Skanderbeg's erasure is not unique. It is symptomatic. It is the same process that has minimized other non-Western, non-canonical stories that did not serve the self-image of the dominant historical traditions. The question is not merely why he was forgotten. It is what else was forgotten alongside him, and what that systematic omission does to our understanding of the past. There is a statue of Skanderbeg in the center of Tirana, the capital of Albania. It stands in the main square that bears his name. He sits on horseback, armored, wearing the helmet with the goat's head crest that appears in contemporary portraits, the helmet he reportedly wore in battle, the one that became part of the visual language of his identity. The statue is large. It is impossible to miss. In Albania, his name is not forgotten. There are statues in Kosovo, in North Macedonia, in the Arborescia communities of southern Italy. There is a square named after him in Brussels. The Albanian army's highest honor is named for him. He is, within the culture that remembers him, one of the foundational figures of national identity, not merely a historical military commander, but a symbol of what was possible in the face of overwhelming force. Outside those communities, the silence remains largely intact. But here is what history has left us with, stripped of sentimentality and nationalist mythology, evaluated only on what the documents show. A man who spent 20 years inside the most sophisticated military system of his age, learned it from the inside out, and then spent 25 more years using that knowledge to defeat it repeatedly. A man who never lost a major engagement. A man who held a strategically critical corridor closed for a generation at the exact moment when nothing else was standing in the way. A man whose death produced genuine panic in the courts of Western Europe, not ceremonial grief, but functional alarm at the loss of an irreplaceable military asset. Was he a hero? The category is insufficient. He was also a man who exercised power in a brutal era through brutal means. His coalition politics involved coercion as well as persuasion. His military victories were followed by consequences that were not always merciful. He was a commander of the 15th century, not a figure filtered through modern moral categories. He was complicated, as every significant historical actor is complicated. Was he a villain? Equally insufficient. A man who spent a quarter-century defending his people against conquest, who built something from nothing in the Albanian highlands, who inspired sufficient fear in Mehmed II, the man who took Constantinople, that the Sultan came personally to destroy him and failed, does not fit easily into a category of condemnation. He was what the era produced, a survivor, a strategist, a symbol, a man whose life was shaped entirely by forces larger than himself and who nonetheless bent those forces, for a time, in a direction of his choosing. The Sultan is said to have called him the Dragon. Perhaps that is the most honest label available. Not hero, not villain. The Dragon. Something ancient and formidable that does not fit inside the simpler categories. Something that takes a different kind of understanding to see clearly. His name was Gjergj Kastriotti. The world called him Skanderbeg. Now you know why that name matters. And the next time someone asks you to name the greatest military commander of the 15th century, you know the answer. The question now is what you do with it. History is not a closed book. It is a record that depends on who does the remembering. For 5 centuries, the wrong people have been in charge of this particular chapter. That is not fixed. It is only what has been true so far. His name was Skanderbeg, and he held the door. Remember that.